Hey, everybody, and welcome back to U-Talk. Listen, we are brought to you, as always, by our friends at OtisWho Network. And today, we're diving into something, well, it's something that hit home for a lot of us. You know those navigation apps we all use?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, the dangers of kind of like over-relying on them. Like, we
Ugh.
use them every single day, right?
Yeah, definitely.
But a recent tragedy in India, where three men, unfortunately, drove off an unfinished bridge because they were following a Google Maps route, it makes us think, how much do we really trust these apps?
Yeah, that's right. It's a horrible story, and it shows us the possible gap between the digital world and reality.
Right.
Like, imagine thinking you're on a bridge that's finished when it's not.
That's terrifying.
It is, and it reminds us that these apps are only as good as the data they're built on,
Right.
which can be outdated sometimes or even just wrong. And in this case, in India, it looks like the map hadn't been updated to show that the bridge was under construction.
So let's dig into the India incident a bit more. What exactly happened?
Well, there were three men driving to a wedding in Faridpur, two brothers and their friend. And they were using Google Maps, and it told them to go onto a bridge
Oh,
over the
wow.
Ramganga River. But the problem was the bridge was still being built.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So there were no warning signs or anything like bridge out?
Sadly, no. According to reports, there weren't any barriers or signs to warn them, and the driver was just following the app's directions.
Right.
He drove right onto the part that wasn't finished, and the car fell into the river.
I can't even imagine. I use Google Maps all the time. And I keep thinking, could that have happened to me?
Yeah, a lot of people are probably asking that same question right now. And it's a valid question. It's easy to trust technology without thinking, especially when we use it so often.
So what should we do? Should we stop using these apps altogether so we
Mhm.
go back to paper maps?
Not necessarily. They're really helpful tools. There's no denying that.
Sure.
But we need to be smarter about how we use them. We need what's called situational awareness. And not just in the real world, but in the digital world too.
Okay, so how do we do that? How do we become smarter digital navigators?
Well, first of all, we need to remember these apps aren't perfect. They use a whole network of data points. GPS signals, satellite imagery, information from users. And any of those things could be inaccurate or outdated.
You know, it's funny. I never really thought about how these apps are using all this different information. I just kind of assumed they were like magic.
Yeah, a lot of people think that, and that's why it's important to understand how they work. For example, GPS signals can be messed up by things like tall buildings or even a lot of trees.
Oh, really?
Yeah, which can make your location inaccurate.
So you could be in one place, but the app thinks you're somewhere else.
Exactly. And satellite imagery, while it is really detailed, can be outdated too, which means the map you're seeing might not show things like recent road closures or construction projects or anything new in the environment.
Wow, so even if the GPS is working perfectly, the map itself could be wrong. That's kind of scary.
It is. And what about all the user-generated stuff? Like the reports on Waze about traffic or speed traps?
Yeah, I always thought those were pretty helpful.
They can be. Using crowdsourcing is a powerful tool. It's basically using the knowledge of a bunch of people.
Right.
But you got to remember, this information is coming from other users,
Yeah.
and not all users are the same.
Some people are probably better at reporting than others.
Exactly. So while it's great to have those real-time updates from other drivers,
Yeah.
you can't always trust them to be accurate or up to date.
So it's like a balance. You can use those reports, but you got to be a little skeptical too.
Right. And that brings us back to situational awareness. We have to be present, not just physically, but mentally when we're navigating. We got to be always checking the information we're getting, both from the app and from what we see around us.
So it's not just about following the blue dot. It's about really being a part of the whole navigation process.
That's right. Imagine you were using an old-fashioned paper map.
Okay.
Would you just blindly follow every line without looking at the bigger picture?
I don't think so. I'd probably be looking for landmarks,
Yeah.
Checking my compass, making sure I was going the right way.
That's the kind of thinking we need to have when we use digital navigation, too. We can't just passively follow the app's instructions. We have to be involved, pay attention, and be willing to question what it's telling us, especially when it comes to something as important as safety on the road.
This is making me think about how I use my navigation app in a whole new way. I'm realizing how much I just take it for granted.
And that's the first step to becoming a better digital navigator, recognizing that these apps are tools, not oracles. They can be really helpful, but they can also lead us in the wrong direction if we're not careful.
You've given us a lot to think about. So before we go any further, let's give our listeners a chance to absorb everything we've discussed so far.
So welcome back to U-Talk. We listen.
Now, before the break, we were talking about how important situational awareness is when we're using these navigation apps.
Yeah,
And I think we've all been there, like blindly following those directions and maybe ending up in a place we totally didn't expect.
definitely. But that India Bridge incident really shows why trusting those apps so much can be dangerous.
Right.
So let's talk about some practical tips for how to become more aware digital navigators.
Okay, perfect. I'm ready to take notes. What's the first thing we got to keep in mind?
One of the simplest things you can do, but also one of the most effective, is to actually look at the route before you start driving. Don't just look at the time it says it'll take and go.
You mean zoom out and look at the whole picture?
Exactly. Get familiar with the path the app is suggesting. Does it make sense for where you're going? Are there any parts that look weird or out of the way?
Like if it takes you through a neighborhood when you're trying to get to the freeway?
Exactly. That's a sign to pay attention. It could be a shortcut, but it could also mean the app's data is wrong. And if anything seems off, don't be afraid to change the route yourself or even switch to a different app.
Oh, right, because different apps use different information, right?
That's right. They have different ways of figuring things out. So if one app gives you a route that seems iffy, another app might have a better option.
Okay, that makes sense. So check the route before you go, and don't be scared to compare apps. What else?
Another important tip is to keep your app updated. It sounds obvious, I know,
Yeah.
but you'd be surprised how many people are using old versions.
Yeah, I guess it's easy to forget about.
Right. And those old maps can be a real problem. They might not have the latest information about road closures or construction or detours, all the things that can affect your trip. So get in the habit of checking for updates, especially if you're driving somewhere new.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's like if you're using a paper map from 10 years ago, you're going to run into some issues.
Exactly. And speaking of preparing, if you know you're going somewhere new, try to learn about the area beforehand.
Even if I'm using a navigation app.
Yes, definitely. It's all about getting a sense of where you are in relation to everything else. You can use a regular map or Google Street View, or even read local blogs or websites to get a feel for the place.
So you're not just relying on the app's version of the world.
Exactly. You're creating a better understanding in your head, which can help you spot any mistakes or weird things the app might tell you.
Okay, so we've talked about planning before the trip. What about while we're driving?
Yeah.
What are some things we can do to stay aware?
This is where paying attention to your surroundings is really important. And I mean, really paying attention, not just glancing around.
So put the phone down, eyes on the road.
Yes, but it's more than that. It's about actively engaging with your environment. Are the landmarks you see matching up with what the app is showing you? Are the road signs saying the same thing as the app's directions?
You mentioned road signs, and that reminds me of those teenagers in Russia who got stuck in the snow because they ignored a road closed sign.
Exactly. It shows us that sometimes the simplest information is the most important. Road signs are there for a reason, and they can often give you more up-to-date information than your app.
So even if the app says go, but there's a big sign saying road closed, maybe it's time to think twice.
Right. And speaking of thinking twice, another big part of situational awareness is being willing to question what the app is telling you.
Don't just assume it's always right.
Right. If a route looks strange or unsafe or just wrong, trust your instincts. Pull over somewhere safe. Double check the map. Maybe even look at a paper map if you have one.
You know, it's interesting. You've mentioned paper maps a few times. Do you think it's still good to know how to use those, even with all the technology we have?
Definitely. I think it's a good skill to have, not just for finding your way, but for understanding how places are connected to each other. Plus, you never know when your phone might die or lose signal.
Yeah, that's true. It's like having those map reading skills is a good backup plan just in case.
Exactly. And even if you never need them in an emergency, they can still help you be more aware and understand the world around you better.
I like that. It's like the more skills you have, the better you are at handling any situation, digital or not.
Exactly. And that brings us back to the main point of all this. It's about finding a balance between using technology and still being able to think for ourselves and be aware.
Because technology is a tool, not something that should replace our own judgment and decisions.
Right. We need to be in control of our own navigation, both literally and in life. We need to be present and engaged and willing to question the information we're given.
And that's especially true in a world where we have so much information coming at us all the time.
Absolutely. We need to develop those critical thinking skills, the filters that help us decide what's true and what's not. And that's a skill that goes way beyond just navigation apps. It's important for everything we do online and in our increasingly digital lives.
This has really been eye-opening. I'm realizing that being safe and smart in the digital world is just as important as being safe and smart in the physical world.
I agree. And it all starts with awareness, being aware of our own biases, understanding what technology can and can't do, and always being ready to question the information we get.
You've given us a lot to think about. So before we finish up, let's give our listeners a chance to think about all this. And we're back for the last part of our deep dive into navigation apps. We've talked about a lot, from that tragedy in India to how these apps work and how we need to be more aware when we're using them.
It's been a long journey, hasn't it? And I think the main thing to remember through all of this is balance.
Balance between convenience and being careful.
Exactly. We can't just let the convenience of these apps make us think everything's fine. We got to remember they're just tools, and like any tool, they can be used well or badly.
It's almost like we depend on these apps so much that we've forgotten how to get around on our own.
In a way, yeah, we've let these lines on a screen tell us where to go. And that's not a bad thing as long as we know the risks.
So how do we find that balance? How do we become more careful digital navigators?
It starts with knowing that these apps aren't perfect. They make mistakes. And sometimes those mistakes can have really bad consequences.
Like with the bridge in India.
Exactly. That's a reminder that we can't just trust technology without thinking. We have to pay attention, be observant, and be willing to question the information we're given.
You know, as you're talking, I'm thinking this applies to more than just navigation apps. It's about our relationship with technology as a whole.
That's a really good point. We live in a time where we're always getting information, data, and distractions from technology. And it's easy to get lost in it, to forget that we can think for ourselves and make our own decisions.
So what's the solution? How do we get that control back?
I think it starts with being aware of our own biases. The things that make us take shortcuts or trust the easy answer or just follow the crowd. We have to be willing to step back, question what we think, and consider different viewpoints.
And remember that technology is a tool, not something that should replace our own judgment and gut feeling.
Exactly. We can't let some algorithm control everything we do. We have to use technology to help us, not the other way around.
So next time you're following that little blue dot, take a minute to stop, look around, and really see where you are. Ask yourself if the route makes sense, if it feels safe, if it agrees with your own gut feeling.
And if something feels wrong, don't be afraid to change the plan, to try a different way to look for more information.
Remember, the safest way is usually the one that uses both technology and common sense.
I like that. And I think that's a great place to wrap up our deep dive. We've talked about a lot of complicated ideas, and we've challenged ourselves to think differently about how we use technology.
And I hope everyone listening has learned something valuable that they can use in their own digital lives. Because at the end of the day, it's about being informed, being aware, and being able to navigate the digital world safely and confidently.
Well said.
And to all of you listening, thanks for joining us on this journey. We hope you enjoyed it. And remember, if you have any thoughts or stories about your own experiences with navigation apps, share them on social media, tag the show, and let's keep talking about this. Until next time, happy navigating.